the line now is Andy Meddick, who was in Parliament last week and one of the MPs up until 2 o'clock in the morning debating the legislation about extending the state of emergency. Andy, good morning.
Good morning, Mitchell. I hope you're well and your family too.
Yeah, we're all going okay, as well as can be expected. But what was it like being in Parliament there, debating the legislation up until 2 o'clock in the morning in the council, and then ultimately the extension passed?
Well, it was a very interesting thing to observe. I've watched Parliament, as you know, very closely over a number of years, and particularly where we've been able to see live broadcasts. And I've now been witness. This is the second time I've been witness to delaying tactics, if you like, using the mechanisms of legislature to actually delay the vote. This could have been dealt with much sooner, and not to 2 a.m. and keeping Victorians waiting on what the outcome was going to be, but for delaying tactics that were used by some in the chamber.
It's a bit different to the US, though. I think they can filibuster there for 48 hours or something, can't they?
Oh, absolutely. And I think there is a record, I can't remember who it is, of one particular senator filibustering for like 13 straight hours or something. Even read a Dr. Seuss book, I believe.
But what was it like being in the chamber? What was the atmosphere like? Because we had the 3 crossbenchers that decided to vote with the government. It sounded like it was a pretty polarising vote. I think it only got up by 1 vote in the end.
That's correct. And it was all the worst of Australian politics on display. I did say in my contribution that I had hoped that, given the severity and the seriousness of the issue, that there could have been some sort of bipartisanship on display, a recognition, at least in people's behaviour, that we were facing a very serious crisis in Victoria, and that we could have extended that into the chamber and respectfully interjected or respectfully not agreed with each other on certain points, but alas, that wasn't to be, and it was quite shameful actually to observe.
What guided your decision-making process on this? Because I think we said on this program that 12 months without any checks or any coming back in or going back to Parliament was a bit excessive, but maybe 3 or 6 months would be appropriate. Would you support the 12 months? Did you negotiate it down to what it ultimately ended up being?
I made it very clear from the start I wasn't going to make this a negotiation principle. I don't believe in horse trading as a principle, and particularly on issues of such public importance. We should not be holding the public health to ransom. So I approached the government and said, look, I think you understand that this is deemed by many people, because what we were actually talking about was changing the Act to have 18 months, which in effect would be a 12-month extension from where we were, because we'd already done 6 of it. What was then deemed acceptable by numerous people, including myself, saying to the government, look, the public need a bit more hope than that, and businesses are certainly telling me they need it shorter, but they still want it. It was brought down to 12, which meant 6 months from now, basically. So I did a lot of consultation. Clearly I spoke to the Nurses Federation. I spoke to the Australian Medical Association. I spoke to the Small Business Association, and I spoke with numerous numbers of my councils. And some of them were actually in favour of a longer extension even than the 18 months. Some of them wanted longer than that. I'm talking some of the councils here. And their reason for that was very clear and very concise. And that was they didn't want infected people, because if the legislation failed, then we would have been in a situation where potentially infected people could travel without restriction. And that meant they would have been travelling into regional areas, including Western Victoria, with the potential of spreading the virus even further and initiating what the Premier has called that third wave, which would have been infinitely more deadly than anything we've even experienced up to now. And I couldn't do that. My conscience wouldn't let me do that. And as a result, I said, look, if you can come down to that 6 months, and if there's consensus across the chamber, then that's it, right? And I think it's worth noting, people should know as well, I think a lot of people over the course of the last few weeks have become very much educated on what the situation is in Victoria, but for some it might not be clear. We are the only state in Australia that has a legislated cap on a state of emergency. In New South Wales, it's not even held by the Health Minister, it's the Police Minister. In every other state, it is unlimited once it is declared. It is up to their health minister to decide when they can lift it. So it can go for 6 months, 12 months, 2 years, 5 years, however long they see fit. Western Australia, for instance, is currently living under 18 different measures of a state of emergency. Now, because they've got low community contact numbers and other types of infection is relatively well contained, their restrictions are very, very similar to what I see when I'm looking at the roadmap out of Victoria. Their restrictions are very similar to what we have as our third step, a combination, if you like, of our third step and last step for regional Victoria. So they're very much like that, except for the fact they have that hard border control.
Ultimately, it's got to come down to checks and balances, doesn't it? And even if you do like the current government that's in power and the Premier, the way democracy works is the other side always gets a go, even from time to time. And if you don't like other people and the opponents to the current government, assuming you do like the government, then you're giving the power to any politician that ends up in that position. So I think 3 to 6 months was a sensible balance. It gives the Parliament the opportunity to scrutinise, but I just thought personally 12 months unchecked was a bit much. And I also think just because the other states don't have a cap doesn't necessarily mean that they've got it right.
Oh, no, I agree with that completely. I'm actually agreeing with you there. I think that what we have in Victoria is the best thing. I think that check, that time frame that we have is perfect. I mean, that means that you don't hand ultimate power to any one person or any authority indefinitely. There should be a check on that. And the other thing that was able to be brought along with this is that now that you have a definite end there, that at the end of that 6 months period, if the state of emergency is still in place, then they have to bring it back to Parliament. The government have to bring it back to Parliament again for it to be voted on. And in the meantime, every single decision that the Chief Health Officer makes and that the government makes will have to be tabled in Parliament with the explanations and figures as to why, so that the public have that knowledge as well. They can then analyse the data and the reasons for themselves and agree or disagree with it.
And in terms of the roadmap out that the Premier announced yesterday, how did you feel about that? Were you expecting more? Is it about right? Your thoughts?
Well, look, on balance, I think it's probably about right. There are things that I think maybe they could have been a bit more lenient on. But you know, I'm basing that on my personal feel. You know, I'm feeling for everybody who's you know been locked up in this scenario. You know, and I guess like everyone, I had hoped that there was going to be more. You know, that it would be a little bit more lenient. But on the balance of it, that was me leading with my heart, not perhaps my head. And when I look at where regional Victoria is versus the rest of the state, versus Metro Melbourne, for instance, I think we're in a far, far better position. And once we hit that, you know, that 13th of September and we start to see those restrictions ease a little bit, I'm hoping that then, you know, people can see the value in what's been achieved by that. And, you know, then appreciate that, you know, that, right, there's 4 weeks of this, and then we move on to the next bit, and then the next bit. And when we finally get to that last COVID normal where, you know, other than, you know, certain other restrictions, which are quite minimal by context of what we're in now, that life will be somewhat more normal to what we had. I mean, I'm looking at it here. I've got it in front of me. And in third step, for instance, you know, interstate travel will be allowed across the third step area. So if we're in the third step at the right point in time, then, and if South Australia, for instance, has opened its border to us and as New South Wales, then that interstate travel will be lifted. We'll be able to have that sort of thing. And that means New South Wales and South Australia will be able to travel into Victoria as well. You know, we'll have that start of that revival of the tourism industry at that point.
And the Premier spoke about Geelong specifically, and I played those comments earlier today. He spoke about the Geelong corridor and said they're quite concerned. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Well, I understand the reasoning. I mean, if we think about it, there are a lot of people who travel normally between Geelong and Melbourne as a commute. There's an enormous amount of people who live in Geelong because it's a beautiful place to live, but work in Melbourne. And there's an enormous amount of freight that travels up that highway every day as well, and backwards too. So it's of a concern in that respect as well, because we also have a lot of industry in the west of Victoria, and that means that, there's a lot of those industries where people are forced to congregate in larger numbers than they normally perhaps would in a work environment. And so there's always that danger of the numbers, if there's a case becomes positive in there, of those numbers getting out of hand. So I understand that. But this to me, if you put it aside that it's Geelong, so we would be the people involved in it, I think that this potentially, I'm reading between the lines here, so please don't take it as gospel, that potentially that signals that, there's an ability or an understanding that if an outbreak occurs in a particular area, that the government is willing to look at that particular area and isolate it, that one particular area and those residents, so that they don't become a danger to others around it. And I think this is a common sense approach as well, to look at where the heaviest outbreaks are and let them have the highest number of restrictions rather than everybody else. I think that's a reasonable thing to do. But again, I'm reading between the lines there. That's not what's in the document. But I think that sort of kind of flags it to me.
And I saw that Samantha Ratnam, the Greens MP who voted in favour of the legislation alongside you, she said that she's been copping a fair bit of abuse online, some of it directed to her baby daughter, which is pretty disgraceful. Have you been copping similar abuse because of your decision?
Absolutely. The three MPs, each of us, have been copping an enormous amount of abuse. Now, I understand that people are upset and that they want to lash out. That's fine. And when you put yourself in the public eye, when you decide to become a politician, does it make it right? No, but it's part of the parcel of what you do. People are going to agree with you, and you cannot expect that some people won't and that they will abuse you just for your opinions. But in this instance, and I've seen some of the things that have been sent through to Samantha Ratnam and her child, and I've seen some of the things that have been sent through to Fiona Patton, and I've certainly seen what's been sent through to me, and some of them are absolutely atrocious. And some of them do break the law, and those have all been forwarded, and those people, I believe, will be prosecuted, and so they should be.
Do you just say let your staff deal with it? I mean, it can't be good for you to be reading all of that commentary. Is it better to just let your staff go through the messages coming through, because it must take an incredible toll?
I try to share the load. I don't think it's fair that my staff should have to bear the brunt of the abuse that's hurled at me. I read a fair bit of it myself. I get rid of a fair bit of it myself. Those are the serious that I believe are serious. I've stored, and so have my staff. And we speak regularly. Immediately after I finish talking to you, Mitchell, we have a team meeting, and there'll be a debrief on all of that where we'll find out how each other are feeling and offer each other support. And there is the option of outside support for any one of us who's feeling particularly targeted or particularly pumped.
And did I see correctly, just last of all, on your social media, that once it had all finished at 2:00 in the morning, you then got up in the Parliament and talked about the plight of kangaroos? Is that right?
That's correct. Because the Parliament has, it follows a certain procedure, right? So at the end of that was the end of what's known as general business, and then we have the adjournment. So the adjournment still goes on. The business of Parliament is still going on, and all of the procedures are still going on. So we had to have our adjournment matters, and so that was what it was. I had to wait until debate on that particular bill had been finalised, and I wasn't the only one. I think there are 12 of us who had an adjournment matter that night.
Well, there you go. Look, thanks for being on the program. Thanks for giving us your insights. Obviously, the abuse, regardless of who it's directed to and what side of politics anyone is on, is just not okay. So I hope everyone, your staff, is just not taking it too personally and just coping with it as best you can.
Yeah, thank you, Mitchell. I appreciate that. And my heart goes out to everyone in not just the Geelong area, but the whole of Western Victoria and the whole of the state. This has been a horrible, horrible thing. I hope you all please just try to stay the course. Hopefully we'll come out of this sooner than later. And look, if you're feeling under stress, please contact Lifeline or Beyond Blue, or at least find a family member who's a great listener that you can unload to. And look, and please stay safe and well, because that's what we want. We want to come out the other side of this with everyone intact. We don't want anyone to suffer at all.
Thank you very much, Andy Meddick, joining us there, the State MP for Western Victoria, representing the Animal Justice Party.